thank you all for coming today to this talk about the history of housing over the past 200 years, from 1820 to the present day. So also thank you to everyone as well who's tuning in online. So I'm Sophia Lambert and I'm a historian. I recently graduated from Leeds Beckett University after studying BA History, and later on in September I'm going on to study an MA in Social and Cultural History. So I'd just like to say that this talk forms part of a programme of events and talks that will be held over the next few months in relation to the 200th birthday celebration, celebrating the 200th birthday of Leeds City Museum. So my colleagues Rachel and Lucy and some of the other volunteers will be giving some talks over the coming months if you'd like to keep your eyes peeled on the Leeds City Museum website and also on social media for any upcoming events. So I'm just going to introduce the topic to you now and just give you an idea of what it is I'm going to be looking at over the next hour or so. So this talk focuses specifically on working class housing in Leeds over the past 200 years, and I'd like to say that I'm going to be looking at the east, the south and the city centre of Leeds specifically, because that's where my interests lie as a historian, but also it's where it links quite well with the exhibition, some of the areas that are covered in the housing section. The exhibition is now open as well if you haven't been able to see it. It's on the top floor, sorry. So I'd also like to say that I'm going to be looking at what was happening in Britain more broadly in terms of the changes in housing. So I'm going to be contextualising some of the developments that we see over the course of the past 200 years by looking at some of the economic, political and social changes. And I'm going to finish up by looking at what the future holds for Leeds and its housing developments. There are a few things that I'm not going to be able to go into great detail about over the next hour or so, just in the interest of time, but also it's not where my interests lie as a historian. So I'd like to note that homelessness is a really important part of the history of housing. A lot of people were made homeless during the Slum Clearance programmes. Originally the council were responsible for rehousing people. But I really feel that this deserves a whole talk within itself. So while I'll mention it in passing, it's not going to form the main focus of this talk. So I'm just going to go back to the first slide now. So the image that you see on screen is of numbers 16 to 24 in Ascot Terrace up in Richmond Hill. So Richmond Hill is an inner city suburb of Leeds. It runs towards the east side of Leeds. It borders on the area in Eastern Park, and it's not too far from the city centre. So it's about 15 minutes walk from Leeds Kirkgate Market. If any of you are familiar with that side of Leeds. So I've chosen this image specifically from the Leeds Photographic Archive online because these houses were such a common sight over the past 200 years. And less so today because a lot of them have been sadly being demolished, like the houses that you see on screen. This photo was taken in 1960, shortly prior to the demolition of numbers 16 to 24 of Ascot Terrace. So what you see on screen is, it looks like just a row of terrace houses, but they are in fact back-to-back houses. And for some of you who may not know what a back-to-back house is, it's a pair of houses that are joined together by their rear wall. So if you look in between the two windows, if you were to stand there in person, you'd see a very thin vertical line separating the two windows, and that in fact indicates it is a pair of back-to-back houses. So this house, you'd access it via the front entrance, and the left window belonged to the house at the front, and the window on the right-hand side belonged to the house that joined onto them, which would have been accessed from the other side of the street. And this here as well, I only found this out recently. These were toilet blocks. So a lot of them now, if you walk through areas of Leeds, such as Richmond Hill, and also places in Woodhouse as well, you'll find that there's a gap every so often between each block of back-to-back houses. Some people turn these into gardens, other people just keep like store bins there. But back in the day, back in the 1800s, this would have been a toilet block shared by each block of back-to-back houses. So we're going to move on to what Leeds looked like during the 1820s now. So Leeds during the 19th century experienced a lot of demographic but also industrial changes. So the town's population grew rapidly. The population almost doubled between 1821 and 1851, from 48,000 to over 100,000 people. And this was partly due to rural migration. So industry had been growing quite a lot in the west and the south of the town of Leeds during the late 17th century, the late 18th century and early 19th century. So Leeds was specifically known for its wool industry. As you can see, I'm sure that most of you will have seen the Leeds coat of arms before. There's two rams, and that represents the wool, our connection to the wool industry. There were also 19 flax mills in Leeds in 1821. A famous example, which I'm sure that some of you will have seen, is John Marshall's Temple Works down Marshall Street, which isn't too far from the train station, and it borders on with the area of Holbeck. And I'd really encourage you to go and see it if you haven't already been down there. It was built in 1836, and it's a magnificent building. It's built in the style of Egyptian revival. So a lot of people moved to Leeds, and especially the areas that grew and continued to grow a lot later as well in the 19th century, especially Holbeck and Hunslet. These eventually became the workshops of Leeds. So industry, especially sprung up around the River Aire, which was the lifeblood of the city. It connected Leeds to the world. So a lot of goods, raw materials were brought in through the River Aire, and then they were processed in the mills and factories along the river. Cloth was traded in cloth halls which were dotted around all across the city as well. And as you can imagine, so as people moved to Leeds, the population expanded, and this put a tremendous pressure on housing stock. So a lot of houses had to be built to house the working population, and this issue became more and more pressing as the 19th century wore on. So what you see on the screen is a quote from G.A. Cook in 1819. So I'm not too sure who G.A. Cook was. I've been unable to find out much information out about him. But if anyone knows who he was or has any information about him, please feel free to let me know at the end of the talk and share it with the rest of us. I'd be very interested to hear more about him. I feel that this quote really sums up what the town of Leeds was like during the 1820s. So the town of Leeds is in general well built, almost entirely of brick. The houses upon the streets of Beck are mean, and the streets and the lanes dirty, emitting disagreeable smells from the dining houses. The southern edge of the town is almost as disagreeable. And though it has some good houses, it has to be said in great measure to have the appearance of a prison. So yeah, it paints a rather grim picture of the town, and as I'm sure you can imagine from what I've told you about the amount of industry that there was, especially along the River Aire and in the south and the west of the town. There was a lot of pollution in terms of air pollution, but also the water was very polluted, so a lot of the dining houses let out their dirty water into many of the becks that run through the town and into the River Aire as well. And this contaminated the water supply. Also the smell, I'm sure you can imagine the smell, especially with the lack of proper ventilation as well in many of the houses that were located close to the mills and factories in the industrial areas of Leeds. So there was a real mixture of housing in Leeds during the start of the 19th century, and this was caused by sporadic development during the late 1700s. So there are a lot of cottages in an area which I'm sure some of you will have heard of called the Bank. The Bank no longer exists. The area was cleared progressively throughout the late 19th century and 20th century. It was an area inhabited by a lot of Irish immigrants, many of whom were weavers and worked in a lot of the flax mills as well in the area, in the Bank and in Quarry Hill and in other areas of the town as well. So, as well, in the city centre, I don't know if some of you might have heard of it, Caregate. I don't know how many of you are from Leeds, but Caregate, it's still there today. It's a street that runs down to the parish church. It runs near Leeds Caregate Market as well. There were a lot of yards off of Caregate and a lot of cottages as well, which housed a lot of artisanal workers as well as the working population who worked in a lot of the mills and factories in the town. Hunslet and Holbeck as well, as I mentioned before, these were only villages at the time, so during the 1820s, but they had a very small but growing working class population. And in these areas, often the housing was high density, and there was a large number of people per acre. And this, along with poor sanitation, led to a recipe for disaster, which leads me on to the cholera epidemic of 1832. This was an epidemic in which over 700 people died between May and November of 1832. So cholera is a waterborne disease, and it's it's caused by dirty water, and it's a bacterial infection that attacks the small intestine. So this was the first large-scale outbreak, which is partly why I chose to focus on the cholera epidemic of 1832. The first large-scale outbreak of Leeds, and it attracted a lot of attention from social scientists at the time. There were numerous reports written about the cholera epidemic, and it attracts a lot of attention as well today from historians. So, due to the layout of the houses, like you see on the screen, and the surrounding buildings, people found themselves living in pretty poor, squalid conditions. So there was a lot of high-density housing, a lack of sanitation, most of the streets weren't paved, there was very poor ventilation as well, and most of the houses and the courtyards were very poorly lit and narrow. And it's in 1833 that we see a report written, and this report highlighted the number of cholera cases that occurred across the town of Leeds. And I'd like to specifically focus on the area of Quarry Hill and the bank as well, because these were particular hotbeds for the outbreak of disease and cholera specifically. So the report highlights that in Quarry Hill there were 52 cases of cholera and 21 deaths. And as well, the report highlights, it gives some of the conditions, states some of the conditions that some of the yards and streets in the Quarry Hill area and in the city centre were like. So around the Quarry Hill area, a lot of the streets were described as wretchedly filthy, dirty or confined. However, I'd like to highlight that there was an area called St Peter's Square. I'm sure some of you might have heard of this. It's now home to BBC Yorkshire and Leeds College of Music. This area was described as clean and confined, and there was actually a lot of middle class housing around this area as well. So this brings me to the image that you see on screen, which is of the notorious Bluebell Fold and Richmond Court. I'm sure that some of you may have heard of Bluebell Fold, because this was described as the street where the cholera epidemic began. This was the place where the first case of cholera was discovered during this epidemic. And it wasn't too far away from St Peter's Square again, where there was in fact a cholera hospital built that offered free medical care to those who needed it, courtesy of the Board of Health. None of this, like I say, unfortunately stands today, but I'm sure that if it had stood, it would have been a magnificent tourist attraction. So, as I say, the image on the screen, this was taken from 1901, shortly before the demolition of Bluebell Fold. And this was actually taken after some improvements had been made to the area. As you can see on the left-hand side, there's a lamppost. They installed street lighting. They also paved the street as well. But back in the 1820s, it would have been absolutely horrific. The streets were paved. Bluebell Fold lacked proper ventilation. It was like the court was narrow. It was just absolutely awful. Hence the high number of cholera cases around the Quarry Hill and Bank area. And it was following the epidemic that the surgeon Robert Baker wrote a report about the cholera epidemic of 1832. So he focused on all the different areas in the town of Leeds that had been affected. And Quarry Hill was an area that came up very frequently in his report. And he concluded that most areas in Quarry Hill were unsanitary. They contained polluted sewerage and had very poor drainage. And it was from this report that Robert Baker tried to educate the wealthier people in Leeds that cholera was caused by street geography and not just by the idleness of the poor. However, I'd like to highlight that there was yet the link to be made between dirty water and the spread of cholera. There were very few improvements made as a result of this report. Sanitation in many areas remained an issue throughout the 19th century. It would only be at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century that we'd see some improvements. And however, in some areas these were piecemeal, whereas in other areas, some areas of Leeds saw some very significant improvements in the lives of their residents were marginally improved. So the reason why I've called this slide Civic Pride and Civic Shame is because during the latter half of the 19th century, the city was also a source of great pride. So in cities like Manchester, that were burgeoning industrial powers, they liked to display their wealth, and they did this through the construction of municipal buildings like the town hall. But I'd also like to point out that this was also a time of great civic shame. So there was a tremendous amount of poverty and squalor, especially in the east end of Leeds. And after the cholera epidemic in 1832, this only got worse with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, but also with the expansion in the town's population. As I said earlier, from 1821 to 1851, the town's population doubled from 48,000 people to over 100,000 people, all living in high-density housing, and this was a hotbed for diseases like cholera and typhus. And it was during this time period that Leeds became known as the City of 1,000 Trades, which I'm sure some of you will have heard the term before. So the city's industry grew rapidly. So we saw the expansion of the engineering industry during the second half of the 19th century. And places like Sweet Street, and the Airedale Foundry became the workshops of Leeds. Firms like Marshall Fowler's came to play a very important part in Leeds' economy. But we also saw the development, as well as heavy industry, we also saw the development of the textile industry in Leeds, and they helped to clothe the town's growing population. And as the town's population expanded, with people moving from the countryside, and also Leeds experienced a lot of immigration as well from places like Ireland and Eastern Europe. These problems only added to the housing situation in Leeds. So other towns as well, like Bradford and cities like Manchester, also faced a housing crisis. So each place had their own solution. So some places built workers' cottages, others built tenements and terrace houses. Leeds built back-to-backs and terrace houses predominantly. So while some of these back-to-back houses and terrace houses were actually of good quality, and this is evident in the fact that many of them stood well into the 20th century before being earmarked for demolition by the council. The conditions were also very, very poor. So there was a lack of clean running water in most places. Like multiple households were having to share a toilet and having to share a pump as well as a source of water. And this was the water supply was often infected by the nearby, like the waste that had come from the nearby mills and factories in the city as well. And as you can imagine, this proved to be the perfect breeding ground for another epidemic. So in 1842, there was another cholera epidemic. And I'd like to highlight that in the west end of Leeds, there weren't any cases of cholera recorded at this time. However, in the east end, although it doesn't sound like a lot, but there were 24 cases. And the reason why we see fewer cases in the west end of Leeds is because it was a lot less sparsely, it was more sparsely populated than in the east end of Leeds. So in the east end, there were a lot more mills and factories and high density housing, whereas in the west of Leeds, a lot of the wealthy industries had moved out of that area and moved north towards Headingley where the air was cleaner and there was a lot less pollution and proper sanitation. I'd like to point out that this was in fact a national issue. So cholera and other diseases like typhus became the subject of public health inquiries and sanitary committees that were set up in places like Manchester and London. And these committees wanted to find out the cause of the rising number of cases of cholera and other diseases that were rife at the time. And this brings me to the map that you see on the screen. And this was the sanitary map from 1842. And it was created by the social reformer Sir Edwin Chadwick, which I'm sure some of you may have heard before, and the aforementioned Robert Baker. So the reason why the area on the right side of the screen is shaded darker than on the left is because these areas were considered unhealthy. These were polluted areas. So as you can see here, it's quite hard to see. These were factories, and the red dots and the blue dots. So the red dots represent the cases of contagious diseases that there were in the area. And as you can see, there are a lot more cases of contagious diseases in the east end than in the west end of Leeds. And the blue spots represent the cases of cholera, which of course were rife in the east end of Leeds in comparison to the west end. These inquiries and the sanitary committee looked into the cause of the rising number of cases of cholera, but they also tried to find solutions to the rising number of cases. However, very few improvements were made as a result of these public health inquiries. It would be only later in the 19th century and into the 20th century where we would see significant gains in terms of improvements made into sanitation, especially in the east end of Leeds. And it was Robert Baker in 1866 that put forward several recommendations for the improvement of sanitation, especially in the east end of Leeds. So he managed to get past a bylaw which actually imposed several regulations on construction of back-to-back houses in Leeds. So out of this bylaw, only one block of 4 pairs of back-to-back houses could be constructed before they had to have a privy or a toilet block constructed in between that block and the next block of back-to-back houses. So many of the houses that survive today that are back-to-back houses date from post-1870. So you'll see some examples of double-fronted houses, and this is where you have a door in the middle and then you have a window on one side and a window on the other. So a window on the left side might be a scullery, and the window on the right will be a living room. And then on the upper floors you'll have a bedroom, and then on the top floor again you'll have another bedroom. And most of them, obviously, well, all of them today have bathrooms installed, but originally they would have had to have used the toilet block. But that's not in all back-to-back houses. There are different types of back-to-back houses. It just depends what time period they were built in, because back-to-back houses carried on being constructed in Leeds well into the 20th century. Their construction was banned in 1909, but Leeds famously carried on building back-to-back houses. In fact, between 1884 and 1914, 9/10 of the 57,000 homes that were built were back-to-back houses. And this brings me on to talk about slum clearance. developments during the 1890s and slum clearance programmes. And this is something that you can read a lot more about if you visit the exhibition upstairs, which is now open. So slum areas were a national issue. This wasn't just an issue in Leeds. This was an issue in many of the industrial towns and cities that had erected a lot of back-to-back houses and a lot of terrace houses as well to house the working population. And the Artisans and Labourers Dwelling Act in 1875 gave the local authorities the power to buy up houses, clear the area, and then redevelop it and replace it with better quality housing. However, the thing is, the council were required to rehouse the inhabitants, but as we'll see later on, this wasn't always the case. It did lead to the exacerbation of overcrowding in several slum areas. As people couldn't afford the rent in the new houses that were being constructed, they moved to slum areas where the rents were cheaper. So several areas of Leeds had been marked for the Slum Clearance programme during 1890, and this comes out of a number of cases of typhus which were located in the Allison buildings in an apartment block in York Road. So York Road is an area near Quarry Hill. It's one of the major roads that leads out of the city of Leeds. And there were a lot of slum houses around there during this time at the end of the 19th century. But it's important to note that, as I said earlier, a lot of the houses that were built were of good quality, and this is evident in the fact that they did stand well into the 20th century. But it was just the fact that the streets weren't paved and there was a lack of proper sanitation in terms of having to walk miles, to find water, and sharing in multiple households having to share a toilet block as well. And this brings me to the image on screen, which is taken from Dr. D. Foster's pamphlet, which was called Leeds London. And this is available to view online. It's open access. It's on the JSTOR website in case anyone's interested. It's a fascinating pamphlet. And it was taken for a photographic exhibition of slum houses in Leeds, and it covered areas including Holbeck and Hunslet, Quarry Hill, and the Leylands. So Dr. Foster, he was in fact an advocate of slum clearance, and he felt that through slum clearance he would be improving the lives of the slum dwellers. He saw it as sort of a philanthropic endeavour. So the image that you see on screen is of a cellar dwelling in Mushroom Court. And Mushroom Court was an area in Newtown, Leeds, which is it's near Sheepscar now, and the Sheepscar Beck. I've chosen this particular image because it's very rare that we see inside of slum dwellings. Most photographs show you the outside of slum dwellings and the streets and the surrounding area, or the front of the houses. It's very rare that we get to see what these places actually look like inside. So Mushroom Court was made up of one-room houses, and it formed part of several houses, several streets in the area that had been built during the mid-1820s as part of the development. So there were other streets, including Rushworth Street as well, which were subsequently demolished later in the 20th century. So if you'd just like to look at the image on the screen, so there would have been one window, I think it would have been somewhere on the left-hand side of the screen, probably, well, it's obviously it's out of view, but generally cellar dwellings, I'm sure you can imagine, were very poorly lit, small and damp. They wouldn't have had running water, so they would have had to have gone down the street, possibly to the next street or even the street after that to fetch water, and they would have shared a toilet block with multiple households. So councils had the power to build houses during the late 19th century, thanks to the Artisan and Labourers Dwelling Act, but they didn't really use it. So some council housing had been built in Leeds by the start of the 20th century, but this was very small scale, and it only housed a few hundred of the over 1,000 families that had been evicted due to slum clearance. So many families have been priced out of the Corrie Hill area because rents were just far too high. I'm going to move on now and fast forward to the interwar era, because this was a time of great change for Leeds and for the country as well, nationally. So the Slum Clearance programmes of the 1890s and early 20th century had to be paused due to the First World War, which took place between 1914 and 1918. But the interwar era was a time of great optimism, and the Prime Minister and the government really hoped that they could rebuild the country and provide homes for heroes. And this was the idea that by building homes for heroes, they'd build houses that were of a good standard for those coming back from who'd been fighting during the war. I'm sure some of you may have heard of this act. The 1919 Addison Act was a key piece of legislation, and this made the local authorities responsible for developing new housing and rented accommodation for the working population of Leeds. So, throughout the country, some councils were more enthusiastic about slum clearance than others. So, for example, in Liverpool and in parts of London, they were very willing to resume the slum clearance programmes. Whereas in Leeds, there wasn't so much enthusiasm for slum clearance. And consequently, well into the 1920s, many of those back-to-back houses that had been earmarked for demolition many of those back-to-back houses that had been earmarked for demolition still stood well into the interwar era. So it's not actually until the 1930s when we see the council's housing committee really start to take action in Leeds. So on this slide, the image on the left that you'll see is of a famous map called Red Ruin, and this was created by one of the city's architects and the director of housing, R.A.H. Livett, who I'll go on to talk about in a little bit in this talk. So the areas highlighted in red include Burnham Tops, Hare Hills, areas like the Bank, much of the east end of Leeds, and these were the areas that had been earmarked for demolition. And now you can't see it on this portion of the map, but further out to the right-hand side, so the east of Leeds, there were a lot of areas, including Seacroft, which had been highlighted for proposed development. So a lot of council houses, as well as private development, was made during the 1930s in areas such as Seacroft, but also Gipton as well. And that brings me to the image on the right-hand side, which shows you an aerial view of Gipton housing estate, in which over 3,000 houses were built during the interwar era. Many of these were semi-detached local authority houses. There actually was some private development, and this, like I say, also goes for areas including Seacroft and Crossgates as well. But I'd like to highlight that over 7,000 of the 222,000 houses that were built between 1925 and 1934 were council houses. So the rest of the 22,000 houses that were built by private companies. So very little progress was made during this time period in terms of the construction of council housing. And this brings me on to the 1930s now, and what we like to call streets in the sky. I'm sure it's a term that some of you might have heard of before if you are interested in the history of council housing specifically. So the image that you see on the side is of Quarry Hill Flats, and this is a sweeping front of Osler House, one of the most photographed parts of the building. And in the centre of the photograph is Appleyard's petrol station. Now that still stands today, and if you would stand at the top of the hedgerow with the town hall behind you and look down the hedgerow, you can see Appleyard's petrol station. Quarry Hill Flats was sadly demolished between 1975 and 1978, and in its place, Quarry House, the Department of Health and Social Security, now stands there, along with West Yorkshire Playhouse as well. So Quarry Hill Flats are very famous, they're internationally renowned, and their design has actually influenced the design of many other buildings, especially some buildings in Liverpool. So I'm not going to spend too much time on talking about Quarry Hill Flats, because if you go to the exhibition, you'll see that it forms quite a large focus of the housing section of the exhibition. So it was during the 1930s that the council began to build what became known as streets in the sky. And this wasn't a concept that was unique to England. It was also something that became quite important on the continent and in certain parts of Eastern Europe as well. So R.H. Livett, who I mentioned earlier, who was an architect and the housing director at Leeds City Council, visited Karl Marx Hof development in Vienna along with Charles Jenkinson, who also worked on Leeds City Council with him, the housing department. And it was this development, R.H. Livett was inspired by the design of the building. So Karl Marx Hof included a courtyard, a kindergarten, and on-site laundry facilities. And it was also the design of the building as well that influenced him. So it was like what they call experimental architecture. It wasn't just made out of bricks and mortar, it was also made out of concrete instead. And it was the arches that R.H. Livett famously incorporated into his design that were included in the building as well in Karl Marx Hof in Vienna. So the Quarry Hill site actually covered 10.5 acres, and it was constructed between it was the mid-1930s and construction finished in 1944, so it only stood for a total of around 30, so 40 years before it was demolished during the mid-1970s. And the idea of streets in the sky is that they had things like walkways. It was revolutionary housing made from concrete and steel frame, not just how houses are traditionally built. out of bricks and mortar. And Quarry Hill Flats had, famously had a lot of pubs, and they had a nursery as well and a bowling green. It virtually resembled a miniature town, and this was a unique concept for the time. Once again, I'm going to fast forward to the immediate post-war era, so 1945 onwards, because construction programmes were paused during the Second World War. And Leeds suffered quite badly during the Blitz. 197 buildings were destroyed as a consequence of the Blitz. The Luftwaffe targeted railways and industrial areas like Kirkstall and Hunslet. So Quarry Hill Flats suffered damage as well from high explosive bombs. And as you can see here in Hunslet, numbers 10 to 12 of Alton Street were subsequently demolished after they suffered a direct hit during the Leeds Blitz. And this is an example of one of the many streets in Leeds that had to subsequently be demolished after suffering bomb damage during the Second World War. And it was in the post-war era that Britain suffered a national housing crisis. So a lot of places like London and Coventry suffered very badly during the Blitz. A lot of houses had to be demolished, and this was a time that proved to be a catalyst for city and town planners to utilise the plans that they've come up with during the interwar era and resume the housing development programmes during the post-war era. So Leeds looked towards quick fix solutions like many towns and cities in Britain. And for Leeds, this included houses like Levitt Cartwright houses, and these were semi-detached houses with a steel frame. And over 2,500 of these houses were built between 1948 and 1956. This also brings me on to talk about what some of the designs were actually looked like that the planners had come up with during the interwar era, which were then constructed during the first few years of the post-war era and into the 1950s and 60s. So the image that you see on screen is of the construction of Saxton Gardens, and this is an area which is quite close to Kirkgate Market, and it stands on the site of a lot of back-to-back houses and mills and factories that once stood in what was known as the bank area. So there's 448 flats in total, and they included shops as well in one of the tower blocks. And the design was revolutionary. So they had central heating, electric lighting. They were warm and dry. They were a world away from the slum housing that once stood on site. And a lot of people I've seen on the comments, they say that they have very happy memories from living in Saxton Gardens and the surrounding area. And some of the comments people make were often about how, sorry, like I say, they were a world away from what they previously lived in terms of terrace housing and back-to-back housing. These flats were redeveloped, by the way, in 2007 by a company called Urban Splash, which I'm sure some of you may have heard of. They worked on Park Hill Flats in Sheffield as well. And here I've done what is known as a history pin. So I've overlaid the image that you saw on the previous slide And I've overlaid it onto Saxton Gardens today. This was taken from the exact angle that you can see on the previous image. So Saxton Gardens are here. This is known as the place, and some of the, and then behind there there's another block of the flat Saxton Gardens, and it goes on for quite a while until it meets up with some old mills and factories that have now been converted into living accommodation. If we fast forward again to the 1970s, so during this time, Britain was experiencing a lot of deindustrialization, and this meant the decline in heavy industry, but it also meant the closure of textile factories and the decline in the light industry as well. So a lot of textile factories and textile production was relocated abroad, where labour was a lot cheaper. And this subsequently led to high unemployment in some industrial areas of Leeds, and a lot of places were left empty. Especially in places like Holbeck and Hunter, which were once the workshops of Leeds. So it's during this period that we see the destruction of a lot of close-knit communities. So communities that have stood for hundreds, have been around for hundreds of years in areas like Richmond Hill, where there was a lot of terrace houses and back-to-back houses. Everyone knew each other, and then they were sadly displaced throughout the 20th century as a lot of the houses were demolished. Even into the 1970s, when the council began to change their policy and focus on improving the last few remaining back-to-back and terrace houses, there was still some demolition, especially up in the Richmond Hill area. So, Spring Close and Dial Street, in this area, a lot of the houses that stood there were demolished and were replaced with council housing during the mid-1970s. And the image that you see on the slide is taken from Richmond Hill News from 1976. And this is a fascinating document. It's held at Leeds City Library if anyone wants to go and see it. It gives us a really good insight into the Slum Clearance programme and demolition of terrace houses around the Dial Street area. So they say in one of the articles in this newsletter that only 60 people had signed up to be housed in the new housing that was going to replace the terrace housing around the Dial Street area. So, as you can see, hardly anyone wants to be rehoused in these new houses that were being built. And this newsletter also highlights the sense of fear that these communities have of the destruction of close-knit communities. These were once thriving communities, and once demolition started, people had to move out and be relocated to, whether it be the suburbs or down the road to Saxton Gardens. They also say, the residents also say that they were kept in the dark about the plans. They wanted clarity so that they could move on and rebuild their community. So the plans seem to be kept under wraps for quite a while, and it wasn't until the last minute that the residents really knew, what was happening. People were scared, was it going to be their house next that was going to be demolished? And the image on the right just shows a row of terrace houses up in Richmond Hill that would be earmarked for demolition and stood vacant for quite a while before they were demolished. And this brings me on to the second to last part of this talk. Sorry, I will wrap this up soon. So, the destruction of communities also led to the creation creation of new communities as well. And I specifically like to focus on the waterfront area in this section of the talk and the South Line as well. So it's around the 1980s and 1990s that we see a lot of urban regeneration projects in Britain. So in Sheffield and Manchester especially, but also in Leeds. So the waterfront had been described as an eyesore in one newspaper in the 1990s, and that's because due to deindustrialization, a lot of the mills and factories had stood vacant for many years, and the wharfs and docks as well along the waterfront were also vacant. Apart from Clarence Dock, which is now known as Leeds Dock, this was used in the 1990s for rail freight. So a lot of buildings were constructed along the waterfront during the 1990s and 2000s, and these were multi-purpose spaces, so a lot of offices, bars and restaurants were constructed with living accommodation above them. So on the left-hand side, the big white building is known as Clarence House, and this was taken down at Clarence Dock, which has now been rebranded as Leeds Dock. So below there you have Sky offices for the firm Sky, and then above you have residential living accommodation. And this is a common theme along the waterfront, the mixture of multi-purpose spaces, so living accommodation alongside gyms and shops and offices as well. So I suppose we've seen parallels as well between Quarry Hill Flats here and what's going on the waterfront. The idea of having a one-stop shop, so you've got shops and like sort of a miniature town. You've got Tesco and things like that, as well as bars and restaurants alongside living accommodation. And the image on the right, we're almost looking to the future here. This is the Situ Climate Innovation District, which sits behind Leeds Dock and borders onto the Cross Green area, if any of you are familiar with that side of Leeds. So the Climate Innovation District, and this is an ongoing development, construction started in 2018, and this is the idea of creating sustainable living. It gives us sort of Scandi vibes. I don't know if you get that feeling, like with the idea of using sustainable building materials. These houses have solar panels on the roof as well. And they're also powered by renewable energy. The firms also try to incorporate a lot of green spaces into their plans as well. So, just a few conclusions to finish up. Sorry, I know I've overrun, but I hope you all enjoyed the talk. So, what we've covered over the past 200 years in terms of changes in housing needs. So, we started off with a small town with a mixture of housing caused by sporadic development at the end of the 18th century, going on into the 19th century. And then Leeds became an industrial giant with lots of people moving from rural places, a lot of immigration as well, and this led to expanding population, which put pressure on housing, causing cramped conditions, cholera, and the diseases were rife. But then, amidst all this, we also saw the creation of really tight-knit, close communities that were subsequently destroyed in many cases when Slum Clearance made very slow progress, but when it accelerated into the 19th and 20th century. And this wiped out hundreds of years of history and wiped out so many communities. But it also led to the construction of new ones, like we've seen at Leeds Dock and along the waterfront as well. So it'd be interesting to see where we go in terms of the development of housing in Leeds. I'm sure some of you will have seen along the waterfront Mustard Wharf and Wellington Square and Tower Works are all experiencing a lot of changes at the moment. There's a lot of housing developments and office spaces being brought down there. So that's just a flavour of the future. Yeah,